The morning in Dry Creek began with a wind that seemed older than the town itself, carrying the scent of dust and sunburnt grass over the rickety roofs and warped boards of Main Street. The lamps in the saloon had gone cold hours ago, but a single light still burned in the sheriff's office window, weak against the pale light creeping over the horizon. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone knows what's already happened, and no one wants to be the first to speak of it. Out from the narrow alley between the barber's shop and the feed store stumbled a woman, her figure bent, each step careful like the ground might break under her. Her blouse, once white, was blotched with dust and dried blood. Her skirt hung torn around her knees. She pressed a trembling hand to her side, where every breath seemed to hurt, as if the air itself had turned against her. Her name was Alara Mayfield, though few in Dry Creek ever bothered to call her anything but Girl or Trouble, depending on the day. This morning she looked like both. Too young to have eyes that tired, too battered to belong to anyone's idea of innocence. She stopped by a hitching post outside the livery, braced herself against it, and closed her eyes. A whisper slipped from her lips, not meant for any ear, not even the Lord's. "I can't breathe, my ribs." Her voice was the sound of someone who had been speaking to walls for too long. At the far end of the street, where the buildings thinned into empty prairie, a lone rider approached, the horse's hooves muffled in the dust. Jonah Calhoun was not a man who drew attention when he could help it. He rode with the ease of someone who had spent more years in the saddle than on the ground. His hat tilted low, the lines of his face shadowed by the brim. His eyes, a pale winter blue, swept the street the way a man does when he has learned to expect trouble in the quiet places. He saw Alara before she saw him, and something in his gaze sharpened. By the time he reined in near her, the few townsfolk already out had stepped aside, some with wary looks, some with that peculiar satisfaction people get when they watch someone else's misfortune from a safe distance. Jonah dismounted without a word. Alara opened her eyes, saw the boots beside her, and stiffened. She knew his name. Everybody did, but knowing a name and knowing a man were not the same thing. He knelt so their eyes met, and for a moment, the street faded into nothing but that winter blue looking at her like she wasn't a spectacle or a warning. "Just a person." "You need a doctor," he said, though his voice was quiet enough that it might have been mistaken for thought. She shook her head. "Can't pay for one." He glanced at the bruises blooming dark along her cheek, the way she guarded her side, and his mouth thinned. "I'm not asking about payment." Her jaw tightened. "If you help me, you'll have the whole town against you before sundown." He studied her for a moment, as though weighing the truth in her words, then said with no heat, "Let them talk." The words had the weight of a man used to standing in the wind until it passed. She didn't resist when he lifted her into the saddle, though she bit back a wince when his arm brushed her ribs. From across the street, Clara Whitlock, who kept the general store, stood on her porch with her arms crossed. "Trouble," her expression said. Jonah saw her watching, but he didn't look away. They rode out of town without hurry, the wind picking up strands of Alara's hair and tossing them against her face. She kept her gaze on the horizon, as if distance alone could outpace the man she'd left behind. Wyatt Blake had been her shelter once, a saloon owner with a smile that could charm coins from a miser's fist. But behind closed doors, charms soured into something sharp, and when she'd refused to help him cheat a traveling preacher out of his money, he'd beaten her until she could taste blood and hear the crack of bone inside her own body. Then he'd dragged her into the street, letting the town see what happened to those who embarrassed him. Jonah's ranch lay beyond the last roll of hills, a modest place set against a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves whispering like old women trading secrets. The cabin was a single room with a stove in the corner, a narrow bed, shelves lined with jars of beans and coffee, and a Bible with pages gone soft from turning. He helped her down, his hands careful as if she were made of thin glass. She didn't like feeling fragile, but she didn't pull away. Inside, he stoked the fire and set water to boil. "Sit," he said, not as a command but as a fact, like telling the sun where to rise. She eased onto the chair, watching him with the suspicion of someone who had learned kindness often had a price. Jonah wrapped her ribs with clean strips of cloth, his touch steady. He didn't ask what had happened. She realized after a while that he didn't need to. Her silence told him enough. The first night passed in the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackle of the fire. She slept on the bed while he took the chair by the door, hat tilted forward, boots still on. By morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and cornbread. They ate without many words. Sometimes he asked if she was in pain. Sometimes she nodded. That was all. In town, Wyatt Blake nursed his pride like an open wound. Word had reached him that Jonah Calhoun had taken Alara in, and it spread fast, carried by gossip with the same hunger as wildfire. Men who owed Wyatt money or favors gathered in the saloon, listening as he spat promises of getting her back. By week's end, he had 6 riders pledged to his side, each with a rifle and a reason to look the other way. Jonah knew they'd come. He worked the ranch as usual, mending fence, tending the small herd, fixing the loose hinge on the barn door. Alara helped where she could, though lifting still pulled at her ribs. At night, they sat on the porch watching the sun sink in slow layers of orange and violet. She found she could breathe deeper now, though it still hurt when she laughed. Jonah didn't talk much, but when he did, the words were plain and carried their own weight. The night the riders came, the air was heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The sound of hooves came first, distant and deliberate, growing louder until 7 men stood in the yard. Wyatt was at their head, his face split by a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Evening, Jonah," he called, like they were old friends meeting by chance. "You've got something of mine." Jonah stepped off the porch and into the yard, the ground soft under his boots. "She ain't yours," he said, his voice calm enough to make the words sharp. Wyatt's smile tightened. "I think she is." The men shifted in their saddles, hands close to their guns. Jonah didn't move for his. Instead, he stood the way he might in a doorway watching the weather, waiting to see if the clouds meant trouble or nothing at all. Alara's hand tightened on the porch railing, her breath catching against her ribs. Wyatt's voice rose. "Bring her out, Jonah. We can make this easy." Jonah's reply was quiet. "She's staying." Silence stretched between them, long enough for the wind to whistle through the cottonwoods. Then Wyatt's hand twitched toward his belt. Before it could reach the iron, Alara stepped down from the porch. Pain flared in her side, but she kept walking until she stood beside Jonah. She met Wyatt's eyes, her voice steady though each word pulled at her lungs. "You broke my ribs, Wyatt, but you won't break my voice again." The men glanced at one another, something shifting in their expressions. One muttered that they weren't paid enough for this, and turned his horse. Another followed, then another, until only Wyatt remained, his pride bleeding out in the dirt. He spat, glared at Jonah, and wheeled his horse around, riding hard into the night. The yard was quiet again except for the soft rustle of leaves. Jonah looked at Alara, his gaze moving from her face to her side, checking for harm. She started to laugh, a breathless, broken sound that turned into something freer. Jonah's mouth curved into the faintest smile. That night, they sat by the fire, coffee warming their hands. Jonah told her she could stay as long as she wanted. She said she thought she'd try calling it home. Months later, Clara Whitlock's store had a dress of cream linen hanging in the window. Alara wore it under the open sky with the wind tossing her hair, and Jonah's hands steady in hers. No church, no pews, just the preacher, the land, and the horizon bearing witness. The vows were quiet but sure, spoken low enough that they belonged only to them. When they rode back to the ranch, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that followed them like blessings. Sometimes love in the West isn't about finding someone to save you, the voice of the land seemed to say. It's about finding someone who will stand beside you when the whole world turns away.